So, firstly, let me start by thanking Lana so much for giving me the opportunity to talk at this um, seminar on organic and sustainable agriculture and meeting the global challenges. I would have very much liked to have been there myself, but as I do everything I can to reduce my carbon footprint, I have offered to record the presentation instead of flying there. So, my name is Andrew McMillion, and I'm a board member of the Norwegian Seed Savers. And I'm going to talk about farming in an energy descent future. In permaculture, we have two founding fathers of permaculture, and one of them is David Holmgren. He's an Australian who worked together with Bill Mollison in Tasmania in the early 70s and wrote some of the key documents, key books, and thoughts behind the permaculture movement. Recently he wrote a paper called Crash on Demand, which has been quite of a thought bomb, so to say, in terms of thinking about what kind of a future we will be experiencing moving forward. The different scenarios that David Holmgren looks at can be seen in this chart here. So, starting 10,000 years ago, he goes through historical time and he shows how the Industrial Revolution has led to an increase in cheap fossil fuels, which has led to the current state in which we have around 400 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. And that's heating up the globe to the point in which we will be experiencing runaway global warming if we don't do something drastic. And the different scenarios then are based on which actions we as a planet take moving forward. Each set of actions has different consequences for the future of life on the planet. So currently, we're looking at the crash scenario. That's where we are today. All of the science is pointing in that direction, that we as a species have not been able to do anything of significance in terms of reducing our carbon footprint, and that will lead to runaway global warming when the positive feedback loops start to kick in, like the permafrost in Siberia and melting that will lead to huge amounts of methane, which is a positive feedback loop, which will then heat up the environment even more, and we will end up getting unlivable uh, conditions most of the planet, which will lead to a huge crash, not only for humanity but for biodiversity on the planet. And that's the direction in which we're headed. So the most likely future scenario at this stage is crash. The other scenarios that David looks at are techno fantasy, which is, the mantra that you hear from a lot of big business, which is, we just need to keep putting money into research and development. We need to keep thinking, moving forward in terms of our knowledge, and we'll be able to solve this problem through geoengineering or any of those types of ideas that, there's no end to the amount of energy we can use. We just have to keep adding more and more technology. It's basically just a fantasy, but it's something that works politically because people like that sort of future scenario, very sort of scientific. It's basically a scientific dream, and has no grounding in the basics of things like entropy, the second law of thermodynamics. Um, and David Holmgren shows this scenario to be, not an area where we should be putting our energy. The area in which most politicians that claim to be wanting to do something about global warming end up in is the green tech stability. And that's not just the case for politicians, but it's also the case for many environmentalists. I would say at least half of the environmentalists that I meet still live in this green tech stability hope that we'll be able to find a way to stabilize CO2 in the atmosphere to a point in which we can keep, more or less keep, the economic system that we have intact, but we just move from fossil fuels to alternatives, and we make a few green improvements, and then everything will be stable at some point, and we don't have to have any real cost to our comfortable lives. David Holmgren is quite skeptical to that being something that we can realistically achieve, mostly because of the Jovan's paradox, which is basically that the more uh, new sources of energy one adds, that does not necessarily lead to a reduction. It usually actually leads to an increase of energy consumption. So instead of moving over to renewables, what we end up getting is renewables are added to the mix. So no net reduction of carbon emissions happens, but the society uses more energy. Norway is a really good example of that. Norway has way more renewables than its neighbors. We, but we don't use less carbon because we have renewables. In fact, if you compare Norway to Sweden and Denmark, Norway has a footprint of something like 10.5 tons of carbon per year per person, and Sweden has something like 6. There's no reason for that to be the case other than the fact that we have access to more energy, and the money that we get from all that energy we decide to use on more consumption instead of reducing our carbon footprint. So basically, just because we have access to alternatives doesn't mean that that will save us in the future. It's important to differentiate that argument from a general sort of techno-optimist versus techno-pessimist idea. What David Holmgren is talking about here is not Ludditism. He's not saying that all technology is bad and we should go back to the Stone Ages. That's not the case. What he's saying is that we have to have a different sort of ethic if we're going to have a stable future. That ethic needs to be based on a deep understanding of energy and how energy flows through an environment. Without understanding what we're actually doing and the effects of our actions and our energy use, all the technology in the world is not going to help solve the problems that we have. So David goes into this Earth stewardship mode, which is basically a mode in which we consume less and we try and work together with the environment to reduce CO2 levels. And one of the main ways in which that is done is in increasing biodiversity and looking at agricultural principles from a whole new perspective. So the permaculture principles are observe and interact, catch and store energy, obtain a yield, use and value renewables, produce no waste, integrate or stack functions, use small, slow solutions, use and value diversity, use edges, value the marginal, creatively use and respond to change. So these principles are quite different than what you would get in regular agriculture. I would say even most ecological agriculture does not abide by these principles. And instead of having what kind of yield are you going to have and everything being focused around production, here we're looking at how do we interact with our environment. It's more about ecosystems resilience than it is about production. So keeping those permaculture principles in mind, I'm now going to talk about what it's like to make the transition from a high energy to a low energy lifestyle by using a few different examples. I'm going to start off by using my own example, and this is me in 2006 when I worked for Apple. Pictures from Cork in Ireland, and as you can see, I'm overwhelmed by liquid crystals. I suffered then from what I called liquid crystal addiction, which sadly I haven't totally been able to get rid of, but at least I've been able to move in the right direction. Um, Basically, I was working for Apple in Austin in 2006, and I was living, what a lot of people would consider the American dream, working for the world's biggest company, and I had a car, I was driving to and from work, and everything that supposedly you should want and strive for in our society. But I weighed 110 kilos, and I was miserable. Um, at some point, I became aware of carbon footprint calculators, and I took the test. It doesn't take much time. I advise everybody to do it. I found out that my personal footprint, annual footprint, was 16 tons of carbon, and I was quite shocked by how much it was. And I started thinking, well, if the real problem in the world is not poverty, but if the real problem in the world is too much carbon, and I'm one of the people in the world that's, on average, way above uh, the average amount of carbon production per year, then I need to do something about it. But of course, knowing what to do about the problem is always the hard part. Basically, I quit my job for Apple and I moved to Norway, and started slowly to move towards sustainability. What I thought was sustainability at the time. I started getting involved in the Green Party, and I became very techno optimistic. I mean, I was already techno optimistic working for Apple, but I became even more techno optimistic. I was all about solar, wind, wave energy, and more green tech. And so this is a picture of me at the annual meeting, and I guess this is 2014, promoting solar panels as the next answer to global warming. So basically, I did everything I could to reduce my carbon footprint based on what science says you can do. I mean, there are three categories in which you can make a difference as an individual, and that is, what you eat, how you live in terms of the energy you use in your house, and how you transport yourself. Those are the three main categories that everybody can do something about. So we bought a small holding in 2009, and we bought an electric car in 2012, and we spent 2011 to 2014 transitioning our farm to an organic farm, and moved our diets to mostly plant-based, whole food, local diets, and started cutting back flying significantly and by around 2015, and in general just reducing, reusing, and recycling. And towards the end of this phase, which I would still call the techno-optimistic phase of my life, ended up getting elected to the municipal board for the Green Party. The next phase of my life I would call the degrowth phase, or the reproduction phase. And during this phase, we managed to get a hold of a 300 square meter greenhouse, which was had been used for flower production locally, and we had it moved over to our farm. So this is a picture of me here in the greenhouse, which is from 2016, looking at cucumber plants. This is a Bhutanese cucumber, actually. In this phase, I started to realize that all of these changes that we'd made simply weren't going to be enough, because not enough people were moving quickly enough in the right direction. I mean, I still believe that if everybody focused on their own footprint, and every company focused on their own footprint, we would be able to turn it around, but that's not what we've seen. So we need to find a way to make people more aware of it and to actually make changes in their own life. Degrowth is one of those movements that really tries to get people to understand that it's not just about making a swap, but it's about actually reducing your consumption. So I advise people to look into the degrowth movement and some of the ideas that have come out of that. But really, it's that Crash on Demand by David Holmgren that got me thinking more deeply about my approach to technology, and has helped me move from sort of a techno optimist to what I would call a techno realist. I'm definitely not a Luddite. I totally believe that technology is a part of the human story, and we need to find appropriate technologies, as Schumacher talks about in Small is Beautiful, and Wendell Berry also talks a lot about that in The Unsettling of America, which are two books I really advise people to read. In any case, I started focusing more and more on the biological side of things and how energy flows through ecosystems. Um, Through that, I got in contact with the Norwegian seed savers, and that totally opened my mind up to the kinds of biodiversity that are possible as far north as we are, and really moved my focus away from production and technology and over to reproduction and stable ecosystems. So, just a little bit more about our farm. It's about a 4 acre farm. As you can see, it's in the middle of a lot of monocultural farms all around. Um, Most of it is clover. All the green space you can see there is clover, which is for ecological sheep production. But then we also have a nice big ravine with lots of biodiversity and sort of a wildlife area in it. And then the big greenhouse is the main production area for us. So we don't have any tractors. We do everything by hand, and we have about 200 different varieties of plants that we grow, and we try and do everything as carbon negative, which is a good thing, as carbon negative as possible. So no tilling. We haven't plowed the farm in the last 3 years, and we just grow everything in the greenhouse, and then try and plant it out as much as we can by hand in raised beds. And we try and grow polyculture. So we try and grow many different plants together and try and find ways in which we can help plants build ecosystems. So it's everything from half a meter under the ground to the entire ecosystem. I mean, one of the benefits of having a greenhouse is that you can really control a lot of the factors in the environment, which is really beneficial the further north you move. Um, so yeah, in 2015 we just started with a clean slate, and uh, they dug all the holes by hand, and then by 2016 in May we were able to get the plastic on, and by that time the clover had already established itself, and as you can see in the background there we have raised beds. It's taken a few years to fill the whole greenhouse up with raised beds, and we're still in the process. But it was amazing how quick we were able to get it to become productive. And yeah, it's just been a lot of fun working with it. One of the biggest benefits is, of course, season extension. So instead of focusing on one plant that we harvest in the fall, which is this sort of standard way of modern agriculture, we're trying to fill all the gaps we can and become as self-sufficient as we can in terms of what we need to consume food-wise on our own farm, which is a much more interesting way of living than just growing one crop, selling that, and then buying everything you need from the store. And you'd be surprised how much better quality food you're able to grow when you try and grow it all yourself instead of relying on global networks of food. So the hunger gap is that time in the year in the spring when you're running out of what you stored from the previous year. You've eaten up all your stores through the winter. And before any annuals start to produce, in which usually people have starved or at least been very hungry. And in permaculture, we found a way to fill that gap with sets of plants that come up very early. And this is the perennial class of plants that that live many years. The benefit with them is that they already have their roots established, and if you can find the types that sprout very early, like this Hablitzia, then you're able to start harvesting even before the last snows have come. So this is a wonderful technique for a season extension and something that we use a lot on the farm. Blanching is another technique that we use. This is lovage, which is blanched, and you can see there's not a lot that's growing here, as this is quite early in the springtime. But basically, all we did in this case was put a bucket over our lovage plant, and the black bucket heats up more quickly in the sun, which stimulates the plant to grow. And since the plant then also doesn't get any sunlight, it forces the plant to stretch, as it's trying to stretch to find light, which it's not able to do. And that gives it a milder taste and it has it produce much more quickly. You can cut lovage or blanched perennials down to almost all the way down to the root, and they will usually rebound if they're well established perennials. So this is a trick to help through the hunger gap, and it's an amazing thing to add to your diet. So as you can see, this is the greenhouse in May. Snow hasn't melted entirely from the roof, but we are already having a good several waves of production that are mostly just continuing from the year before. There's all kinds of stuff. And in the background there, you can see we have a table with a small greenhouse on it, which is our heating bench, which I'll talk more about later. But basically, we just have lots of varieties of plants here that are just getting started in the beginning of the season, but which we are already able to harvest significantly from in March and April. So one of the things that we like to do on our farm is to constantly be using every square meter to its maximum. We're thinking in terms of photosynthesis, of course, in terms of making sure that we don't have too many gaps through which the light can reach the ground level, because that's not, it'd basically just be wasted real estate. But also in terms of trying to get the most out of each square inch, and keeping any ecosystems holes filled. So some of the techniques we have, which you can see from this salad, which is an early salad, that there are a lot of wild and semi-wild plants. And here we can see different kinds of lamb's quarters, and lamb's quarters is one of the things we just let go to seed in our greenhouse, and we even sprinkle it around in the beds in the fall because that's a super easy plant to weed. I mean, you just pull it and it comes right out of the ground. It's not hard. And by what we call active weeding, by actually intentionally planting weeds, the benefit of intentionally using weeds this way is that you can control other more difficult weeds from establishing themselves, and these are edible weeds. So you get, the problem is the solution. It's one of those permaculture approaches. So some of the plants that we use for this are Mitsuba, Amaranth, Quinoa, Chard. These are all easy to establish self-seeding plants. And another method that you can see here is we have tomatoes that are in the process of establishing themselves. And then we have salad that fills the gap between the salad and the beans. And here we're intentionally planting the tallest plants on the north side and the slowest growing plants on the south side so that they don't shade each other. The salads only take a few weeks till they're ready. So while the tomatoes are establishing themselves, the salads are harvested, and then by the time the tomatoes are big enough, then that space that was used by the salads is then used by the tomatoes. Another thing you can see here is that we actively use mulch. So you have, in this case, you have lots of leaves, and we always have at least an inch of mulch on top of our soils, so that there at no time will you ever see open soil, or very rarely see open soil. And that is to keep the carbon and the organic levels in the soils at a maximum. and that keeps water in. And as you can see there, we also have a drip line, and that we put in early on so that we don't have to go around watering the plants. That just is just something you flip a switch and the water goes down. So animals and plants are quite similar in that regard, that they want easy, even access to nutrients, water, and oxygen. So as long as your soil has enough oxygen, that is to say it's aerated enough, and that you have enough water in an even access and enough nutrients, then your plants will be happy and healthy. And if they're happy and healthy, they won't easily be attacked by diseases or other insects, and therefore you won't have to use a lot of insecticides or pesticides to keep that under control. So that's, in brief, a stable ecosystem, and it works really, really, really well. Except that it is quite nutrient intensive. That is to say that you have to put nutrients in equal amounts as you take them out. So the question is, how can we do that in a sustainable way? Well, compost. So we compost everything on the farm in different ways. We have heat bins, that is to say, well-insulated compost bins, into which we put all of our waste, any kind of organic waste, and we always put them in layers. So you put one layer of brown and then one layer of green. That's one layer of carbon-rich and one layer of nitrogen-rich. And if you keep doing that in a well-insulated compost bin, then you'll just constantly be building soil. And that's what we then put that. We just put it on top of the beds, the raised beds. As soon as we have enough compost, we go and we spread that compost out. And the same thing goes for mulching. As soon as we have a bunch of green cuttings, let's say we cut the grass, we have a bunch of grass that we've cut from the lawn. First thing we do is we don't just leave that grass laying around because it's full of nitrogen. We lay that on a nice even layer, especially around the plants that need a nitrogen boost. And as long as you have lots of micro activity in your soil, lots of worms and rich microbiology in your soil, then they will use the available organic matter and digest that down quite quickly. So our soil is just filled with worms, and they just suck down all the carbon and break it down into nice soil. So there's constant feeding of the soil, and then a constant extraction of nutrients, which we then can eat. So it's a cycle, and as long as you continue to think of it as a cycle and treat it as a cycle, everything will be totally fine. So in this final slide here, from our greenhouse, we can see that there are multiple layers of activity going on here. One of the things that we try to do on our farm is to make sure that we don't keep the production the main focus, as I was talking about earlier in terms of permaculture principles. That can be quite a distraction. We're trying to focus on reproduction because that's one of the areas that is a gap in terms of knowledge this far north. Since the last 100 years, there's been a decrease in the number of plants that Norwegians are able to reproduce themselves, and now we're talking about cultivars. And I'm expecting the same thing is the case for wild and semi-wild plants, but at least in terms of cultivars, both the knowledge and the actual reproduction levels have decreased in the last 100 years. So we're trying to be a part of the change to make our society and our ecosystem more resilient, and that means that we have to focus on reproduction. So a plant, to be in harmony with its ecosystem, has to reproduce. And so what we're trying to do is to every year have new varieties of plants that we have saved seed from on our own farm, so that eventually the aim is to be 100% self-sufficient in our own seeds. And by doing that, we're also helping the varieties adapt to conditions that we expect Norway will be experiencing, not just Norway, but the Nordics will be experiencing within the next 20 to 30 years. Our perspective is that the real crisis is going to come sometime between 2030 and 2050, as to say the proper energy descent in which society will just break down as it is now. And when that happens, to have biology that is well adapted to those conditions is going to be priceless. By using greenhouses, we can both increase the humidity levels and the heat levels while maintaining the same light conditions, or more or less the same light conditions as we will be experiencing in the future. So by growing biodiverse amount of a big biodiversity in greenhouses, we're actually mimicking the conditions that we should be experiencing within the next 20 to 30, 40 years. And this is giving plants a head start. So here you can see on the right we have carrot seeds. We got from that we bought about 3 kilos of viable seeds, which we're quite happy with. We have chilies. So it's a Siberian chili, and then we have Mongolian leek, and a whole bunch of other plants in here too that we are saving seeds from, and that in some cases we're already at the third or fourth generation. So, but there is a trade-off. When you focus on reproduction, you can't focus as much on production. It is just how it is. If you have 200 varieties and you're trying to save seeds from, let's say, 10% or 20% of those, the amount of time that you spend focusing on reproduction means it goes at the cost of production. So anybody taking seriously the reproduction side of their farm has to consider the fact that that will decrease the production rate. But of course, that only makes sense. I mean, we don't want boom bust exponential growth cycles. What we want are stable ecosystems, and for that to happen, we need actually less production and more reproduction. One of the interesting effects of focusing on ecosystems building instead of production is that you can look at how you interact with carbon cycles. One of the studies I did just quite simply was to see what's the effect of planting 3 pine trees every year over the period of 30 years. And what I found is that the amount of carbon that is stored by one person planting three pine trees a year, and we're talking about a pine that's fairly quick growing, that you can half your total footprint if you're a Norwegian. You can half your total footprint from 10.5 tons to 5 tons a year simply by planting 3 pine trees a year. That's actually not very difficult. So I think it's important for people to realize that, you know, this is a long-term perspective that we're looking at here. We're trying to enter people into long-term relationships with their carbon cycles. Another effect of focusing on growing your own food and eating your own local food is that it affects your blood levels. This is my blood results from the last 8 years, and as you can see, I was way above the recommended level of how much triglycerides and cholesterol you should have in your blood. But as of last year, I'm in the right zone. So moving on, I'm going to also be talking about 2 other farms here, just to give an example from other farms in the Nordics. So I just went through my farm, and then now we're going to go over to Philip Weiss's farm, and then later to Tycho and Caroline's farm in Denmark. So this is Philip Weiss's farm, and he's well ahead of me, so it's sort of the aim for me is to end up more like this. He's focused a lot more on perennials than I have, and he has a huge variety of nut and fruit trees, and it's just extremely inspiring to see him work. You can see his greenhouse is about half the size of my greenhouse, so 150 square meters, but you see he also has a water catchment system, which I've copied on my farm, and he's got ponds that he's dug and planted trees all around his farm. This is his house, so you can see he's added a little greenhouse veranda there. Got solar panels on the roof and root cellar, and yeah. This is his blog if anybody wants to have a look. It's in several different languages, and I really advise people to have a look and communicate with him. He's got so much knowledge about food forests, and one of the reasons why food forests are way more sustainable than monocropping has to do with mature and immature ecosystems. Basically, when you have monocropping, you have an immature ecosystem. you have to degrade the ecosystem every year by plowing and then planting anew. But when you have mature ecosystems, then you're able to totally utilize the nutrition and to maximize the amount of photosynthesis that the aerial that you manage is able to absorb, and to reduce the amount of nutrient loss from that system. So there's a lot about food forest gardens we could talk about, but that's something that Philip Weiss is well advanced on, and advise people to contact him. There's some more examples of how he has been pushing his farm in the direction of binding more carbon, capturing and storing water, and increasing biodiversity. This little nursery you can see here. And you see there's his heating bench idea, which is something that I copied. Basically just electric cables into a small heating bench with a plastic covering over it. And that's how you get things started early. There's his basement, which is full of plants. And I also have used my basement actively to overwinter young plants, especially perennials. So that's Philip Weiss. Tycho and Caroline's permaculture farm is in Denmark, and that's an amazing place. I went to visit it in 2017. They bought a tiny little plot of land. It's only 1,000 square meters, so my farm is good 10 times the size of this farm. But their aim was to see how small of a piece of land can you actually sustainably live off of. And believe it or not, they were able to build their house on this piece of property, 1,000 square meters, and live off of it, and make that transition in just a simple matter of 5 years. The total cost for both the land and building the house was 307,000 Danish crowns, which is, I mean, it's about what people pay for a garage in Norway. It's just amazing. They have a 50 square meter greenhouse. As you can see, there it is in the, I suppose it's the spring, and then in the, towards the fall, with the grapes hanging off the roof there. So grapes are also one of those plants that we're growing in our garden. As you can see, they also multi-purpose it to be a shelter for their the birds during the winter. And here's their relation between annuals and perennials, which I find quite interesting. It shows how if you diversify to have both annuals and perennials, then they complement each other quite well throughout the year. So that when you have lots of annuals, you don't have many perennials, and vice versa. They also grow on their roof, which is their, it's on the north side of their house, which is also their pantry. So this is their property in 2012 when they bought it. And there it is in 2016, in full bloom. It doesn't take long to make a sustainable transition. Finally, I want to talk about the Norwegian seed savers and community seed banks and participatory plant breeding. Community seed banks, KVAN, that's the Norwegian Seed Savers organization that I'm a board member of. Basically, community seed banks are, as opposed to industrial seed banks, are based on loose networks of seed savers. It can be farms, it could be hobby growers who work together to maintain a decent level of diversity. As you can see here, there's been increase in community seed banks in Europe over the past 10-15 years, which has been really inspiring to see, and to be a part of that movement is really rewarding. This is a class on seed saving that we had, where we invited the SESAM, which is our sister organization in Sweden. They came and held a class on seed saving, the House of Literature, last year, and it was twice the amount of people that we expected to show up. And here we are having a stand on seed saving at the Botanical Gardens in Oslo, and we teach about stratification, about how to get perennial seeds into productive mode, and teaching kids about biodiversity is also really something that I advise. It's here's my son's class in the greenhouse, looking at cucumbers and beans, and kids just love this sort of thing. I think kids love plant farms as much, if not more, than they do animal farms. It's just that most plant farms are monoculture, so that's quite boring. But when you have a polyculture farm, then it's much more interesting. And here we have small plants. This is amaranth in front that we're selling at the local environmental festival in Oslo to raise awareness about what we call Nordic superfoods. And here we are at the end of the season at the Botanical Gardens again. So I want to talk a little bit also about low entropy, or about entropy in general. Most farmers and people who know something about plants know about nutrition and about photosynthesis and sort of the basics about how to get plants growing, but very few people actually seem to know much about entropy and about how energy moves through ecosystems. Now, this has been something that's been quite important for me to understand in terms of being able to build resilient ecosystems. One of the most important things to understand is that we need to be able to separate ourselves from our environment in a stable way, and this is all life does this. I mean, any multicellular organism has a sort of a membrane that separates itself from its environment, be that a skin in human beings, or bark on trees, or shells on plants that don't have outer boundaries. And these are non-equilibrium systems, and that is to say that energy moves in our ecosystem. Energy moves from the sun, where it is in condensed form, to the earth, and in past the earth out to outer space and towards equilibrium. And we are in between that at a non-equilibrium state. So we're in between the condensed form of energy and the dissipated form of energy. So in that gradient, life lives off of the flow of energy as it degrades, as it goes from high level energy to low level energy. And plants feed off of that through the process of photosynthesis. So what I've done in our greenhouse is basically just created a new skin. The old farmer that I bought the greenhouse from, he used to heat the entire greenhouse. Now, our greenhouse is 300 square meters, which is 1,000 cubic meters. So if I was going to heat the whole greenhouse like he would, it would take an immense amount of energy in the spring to do that. What I realized is that the plants are tiny at that stage, and you don't actually need to heat the whole greenhouse. So it was Philip Weiss who showed me how to do this, basically just by creating a heating bench and then covering it with another membrane. So this is a membrane within a membrane, and what we have is heating cables that are just laid out on an insulated table, and then a small half-meter tall greenhouse around that heating table. And this is something that we can use to get plants started in early in the season, and we don't have to heat the whole greenhouse. So the amount of energy that we need to be able to successfully grow sprouts in the greenhouse is minuscule compared to what normal growers who would heat an entire greenhouse use. On top of it, on very cold nights, we can even stack in 2 layers, right? So it's really just these bottleneck nights where it's going to be -5, -6, around there. Too cold for the plants to survive in the greenhouse. During the daytime, they're fine, but at night, they're not. So you take them and put them in on top of each other in 2 layers, and then you cover them. And on the real cold nights, I might even also, in addition to the heating cables, I might also have a little fan in there to keep the air warm enough. And this works extremely well and hardly uses any energy. We also have a water catchment system where the water runs off of the roof of the greenhouse. The greenhouse is at a 5-degree slant, so all the water collects in a drum at the end of the greenhouse and is pumped up to a water tower, which is about 3 meters high and holds 2,000 liters of water. And that's enough to feed the whole greenhouse through a drip system for about a week. I am also able to connect directly to the mains, but I mostly use drip line systems. So there you see the drip line laying on top of the mulch. It should usually, in this early it's on top, but it quickly gets covered by mulch. And there's the seeds or the flowers of the carrot. There we are in the, in the fall or in the late summer. One of the benefits of growing multiple, or biodiversity rich ecosystems is that you get positive feedback loops. In this case, we are looking at a Bombus subterraneus, which is a bumblebee species. Norway has 25 of the world's 250 bumblebee species, and this one is extremely rare. This is the first time that this bumblebee species has been seen in this part of the country. And it was totally wiped out in England, and they've been trying to reintroduce it from Sweden and New Zealand a couple times. But this is one of the positive aspects to building ecosystems, which I have to say gives me almost more than eating the produce, to be able to see species thriving and enjoying themselves in an ecosystem that I'm a part of building. That gives quite a lot of joy. And also interested in different types of medicinal plants. This is a valerian, which is a medicinal plant that I'm enjoying growing and saving seeds from. And daylily, another plant that's fun to grow, and you can adds a lot of color to salads. This is a certain kind of a special kind of hybrid hazel that I got from Philip Weiss, which is a cross between two American bush hazel species and the European tree species, and it gives a much bigger nut and with a thinner shell, so that's easier to crack and gives you more bang for your buck, so to speak. So these have just been established on our farm last year, and it's going to be fun to watch them grow. We should start getting some harvest from them maybe next year already. There's a Mitsuba, which is one of the Japanese semi-wild plants that we got from Stephen Barstow, who's the head of the Norwegian Seed Savers, and I share seeds with here. You can see it's going to flower, so that's a fun plant. And this is a Japanese Shinshu bean with carrot seeds underneath. And here we see amaranth on the left and mouse melon on the right. These are really fun plants to grow. Kids love them. People find them extremely beautiful. And if you're a vegan, then it's really important to make sure you get the right balance of the essential amino acids. And amaranth is one of those plants that has a really good balanced amount of the different essential amino acids. So these are types of things that you need to think about too. And as you have more and more of a plant-based diet, then you need to look deep into the the DNA of the plants to find varieties that are good for you. Squash is one of the branches of plants that I really love. I've grown about 50 different kinds of squash, and I grow squash for all different seasons, all different uses. And watermelon, that's also a cucumberate that we love to grow. It grows quite well in the greenhouse, and we just love eating it. Yakun, that's the one you see there on the left, and we got some Japanese yams there, which grow huge tubers, and we got from Tycho and Caroline. And yeah, you've got mouse melon back there. You got chili underneath. Grows really well with mouse melon. As soon as we were done harvesting the carrots, we sowed new carrots right away, and we'll see how that works. I'm not sure. It's just a test. That's one of the things that it's important to do, is to just play around with stuff too and see what works. Since very few people are playing around with greenhouses this far north, there's hardly anybody to copy. So yeah, just play with it. The worst thing that happens is they don't sprout, and then you've wasted some seed, and then you just, if you grow your own seed, you've got enough seed, so that's not a problem. Stratifying, this is the water test, which you put nuts into water to see if they float. If they float, they've got air in them, they're not going to sprout, toss them out. And you stratify them by putting them in some kind of humid, I use sawdust usually, and then as soon as they sprout, you plant them. This is a kale, which is a special kind of a hybrid Grex kale between two different kinds of kale, which I'll talk more about later. And here's one of our urban agriculture projects in Oslo, where we showcase a lot of different Nordic superfoods, which is, try and get people to understand the amount of biodiversity that we have. As you can see, the skyscrapers in the background, so there's quite a contrast. And here's another urban agriculture project we worked on this year. This is before, and this is after. And now there are, within one season, we suddenly have 50 people with their own little kitchen gardens and growing their own food. And it's great to see these kinds of projects sprouting up in the cities. and people sort of reconnecting with nature and biodiversity. There's the same spot in the fall. Finally, I want to talk about participatory plant breeding, which I've been doing with a number of different organizations, but especially with the Experimental Farm Network. So in 2011, a grower in Wales called Graham Jenkins noticed that her purple tree kale, which is a perennial tree kale uh, that grows, it can can grow to be 3 meters plus and can live 20 years, but rarely goes to seed, was going to seed in her garden at the same time as her very hardy Daubenton perennial kale was also going to seed. She managed to save seeds from that cross between those two and sent them to Chris Homanix, who is part of the Experimental Farm Network and a really good plant breeder in Oregon. He improved it further by adding some Danish kale collar variety called Spitsbladen and other kales from southern Oregon to the mix, and then sent me and other breeders within the participatory plant breeding Experimental Farm Network seeds in 2015. I've grown them out, and they've now overwintered 2 winters. I guess suppose this is the second or third winter that they're overwintering, and I think they're beautiful. I mean, have a look at that. That's variegated, one of the variegated. Maybe about 5% of the genetics look like that. Most of them are. There's when you cross different varieties, you get a really big expression of genetics. So there's everything from the purple aspect of it, which is fairly tall, to the very low bush quality of the Daubenton, and a lot of stuff in between. And what we're doing now is we just continue to select the traits that we like, basically by selection. By I mean, which plants are able to overwinter outdoors, and which varieties look the best and taste the best. And by sharing with other farms at the same time, we don't have to spend all of our time selecting ourselves. We can select with other people, and that thereby speed up the process. So here again, we're talking about appropriate use of technology. It's not like we're stuck in the dark ages and we're not communicating with each other about interesting finds. We're using our network for something positive. We're sharing the genetics, and we're sharing our knowledge and trying to help plants adapt to local conditions by cooperating with other farms who have similar types of needs as we have. So this is something that I'm sure we will see a lot more of moving forward. Here's just a quick comparison of the original purple tree kale, which I also grow here, seeds, which you see in the middle, and then the Grex on the outside. So it's much more productive. There's all kinds of projects that we have in terms of participatory plant breeding and just plant breeding in general. Here we have the greenhouse in the fall. As you can see, there are multiple waves, both seed saving, of sowing, and of harvesting in the fall, which is it's a beautiful thing to be working on many levels. It's more like surfing than farming, really. You've got one wave after the other of plants. You're not just waiting for that one big cash crop. You're interacting with it as an ecosystem, and in the ecosystem, things happen in waves. They don't just happen all at once. So here we're using the grow bench that we use in the spring for sprouts. Now we're using it in the fall to dry carrot seeds. And there's another project that we're working on and trying to become self-sufficient in garlic, which is fairly easy to do, and testing out all different kinds, big ones, small ones. That's an elephant garlic you got there, which I quite like. So harvesting, both harvesting tomatoes and drying seeds at the same time. This is a Shetland kale, which is one of the rare cultivars that I'm working on. And this is Yakun, which is another one of the lost crops of the Incans that we're working on improving. Quite a nice tasting plant. And this is kiwi, super hardy kiwi, which is a perennial and a vine, and hopefully, if it continues to do well, it'll end up covering the whole north side of the greenhouse, and we'll be able to harvest small grape-sized kiwis every year without having to do any work at all. Um, Lovely, lovely thing for kids to have too. Yep, more and more spinach. I mean, spinach comes late and early, so it's great. This is compost bins, like I was saying. It's all about nutrients. So, this is as important, if not the most important part of growing for an ecological farm is the full cycle. And this is the last end of the cycle and the beginning of the new. This is a local seed company and their seed cleaning machine we're looking at. And this is some mouse melon seeds that I saved last year. CSA network, that's also something we're looking at, community-sponsored agriculture and the possible overlap with community seed banks. Reco, this is like a local network where farmers can sell their produce directly to end users just from the backs of cars. This is an idea that started in Finland in 2013 and has just taken over. Now about 80% of Finland is covered by something like 200 rings on Facebook and has 200,000 members or more. Sweden last year had a flowering of about 60 different rings, and it just came to Norway late last fall. This is appropriate use of technology. It's linking local producers, farmers, with consumers who want fresh local food. This is bypassing the whole production, the whole centralization through shops, and going back to a more sustainable kind of agriculture where people are directly linked to the farmers that produce their food. And here's some more experimenting that I'm doing. This is a Sachi tea, which is a rare form of tea that was first developed by a peasant in Sachi in 1907. And it's the most hardy tea variety, which I'm going to test out in the greenhouse this year. And my aim is to become self-sufficient in caffeine as well. So hopefully I'll be able to get off of coffee and over to the Sachi tea if I'm able to grow it in the greenhouse successfully. This is one of my favorite squash, and Mandan squash, which is a very rare variety from the Mandan tribe. This is the lady who was the last corn priestess of the Mandan, and my seeds come directly from her. And I was able to produce viable seeds for the first time in Norway from this variety, and I hope to be stewarding this variety moving forward. Finally, I want to show a picture of my son and I collecting acorns in the fall. And like I said earlier in the program, it is possible to become carbon negative. That is to say, it's possible to bind more carbon than you release. And I think everybody needs to think about their carbon budgets more than they're thinking about their financial budgets. It's not to say that one is right and the other is wrong. It's to say that both are right, and you have to understand the relationship between the two. This is something that the whole planet needs to adopt on every level. We can't just let the politicians deal with this problem. We can't let the companies deal with the problem. We can't just deal with it ourselves. All levels of society have to think in terms of nutrient cycles and in terms of ecosystems if we want to turn things around. Technology is not alone going to solve the problem. It's understanding how ecosystems work, applying appropriate levels of technology to our relationships with ecosystems. And that's the conclusion of today's talk. Thanks so much.